Our first speaker is someone I've worked with on many connections on the Indian Ocean. He works at the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center as Senior Program Officer, which is the home of the website Indian Ocean and World History. He oversees SQC's domestic educational and cultural program. He received his PhD in modern Middle East history from the University of Maryland College Park in 2015 and his BA from Cornell University in 2009. Prior to joining SQCC, Dr. Guthorn was a 2013-2014 Fulbright Fellow in Amman, Jordan, and taught at the University of Virginia as a visiting lecturer on Middle East history in 2015-2016. So I'd like to welcome him to kick off our day today. He's going to speak about the historical background.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I've been given the task of giving you roughly a snapshot of over 1,400 years of Muslim-Chinese relations in a little more than an hour. So let's get started. And also for anyone in the audience who knows any Mandarin, I apologize in advance for the butchery of that language that I'm about to do. As Susan mentioned, I'm a modern Middle Eastern historian by training, so the Arabic I'm okay with, the Chinese, Mandarin, we'll get there somehow together. And at any point as I'm going along, as I said, I'm covering quite 1,400 years of history. If you have a question, I go too fast, please do stop me. You're all teachers. I'm sure you're all extroverted enough to jump up and down and stop me at any point if need be. So today, I want to give you the understanding of both the connections between China and the Middle East, and which both predates Islam, and then how those relations change and are deepened and complicated with the birth of Islam in the 6th century. So the earliest connection we have, and this is the legendary connection between China and Muslims, is the legend of Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas, who is the maternal uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, and it is rumored that he made his way to southeastern China, the Guangzhou region, also known as Canton, in the year 632. This is really kind of the foundational, for lack of a better word, myth of Chinese Muslims, of dating back to merely at essentially the very end of the Prophet Muhammad's life that Muslims made their way to China. This really isn't substantiated in any actual archival or historical documents. It's more the first record we have of contact between the Muslim world, which at this point would be under the rightly guided caliphs, or the Rashidun, is from a communique from the Muslim general Utbah bin Razwan when he conquered Basra, when he sends a communique to the caliph Omar ibn Khattab, who says, "Thanks to God we conquered Basra, whence so many junks were coming from Oman, Bahrain, Morocco, India, and China." Junks is a word for a ship. And this indication is actually really, it's our first written indication of connection between the Islamic world and China, but it's likely that the connections between the Arab world and China predate this by centuries, if not a millennia. So in a moment I'll talk to you about the two major connections between what we kind of think of as the Middle East, or the heartland of the Muslim world, and China, being both the Silk Road and what's been called the Maritime Silk Road. And that maritime connection, we know, goes back, long predates the birth of Islam. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit more in just a moment. This first written record we have of Islam in China itself is from a little bit later, from the year 651. And in the second year of Yonghui, the king Tashi, which is a reference to Arabia, Amir al-Mu'min, which Amir al-Mu'min is a title that means roughly translates to the leader of the believers. And the early Muslim community would be referred to a mu'minun, or a group of believers. The title of Muslim is a title that we don't have in writing for a bit later. So this is the earliest connections to that ummah, that community of believers. Sent an envoy for the first time to the Chinese court bearing tribute. He announced that the house of Tashi had already reigned for 34 years and it had 3 kings. That reference to the 3 kings is how we would understand for the Islamic Empire the caliphate of the first 3 of the rightly guided caliphs. meaning Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman. And from this very, very early period of Islamic or Muslim connections with China, we actually have our first landmark, which is known as the Canton of Guangzhou Lighthouse. It's also known as Huishengxi, and is located, as I said, in southeastern China. And this is reputed to be the first mosque built outside of Medina. We don't know exactly when it was built. Again, we have that same legend of the uncle of Muhammad coming to China, possibly building it or being part of the dedication of this mosque as early as the year 630, but we don't have any records or any proof of that actually taking place. Instead, it's more likely it happened possibly 50 to 100 years later during the Tang Dynasty. But even that being the case, this still is a representation of a very early Muslim population within China. And it's notable as well that it's not, this is, as you notice, this is quite an imposing structure. The Lighthouse Mosque, as it's known, because the minaret was also used as a lighthouse. So this is a very unique type of architecture. It's not an architecture that you find in other mosques throughout the Muslim world. So it's already a unique form of architecture for Chinese Muslims. And we know the minaret and the mosque itself are rebuilt and expanded in the year 1350, and it's been maintained until today and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Yes?
I have just a quick question. Is there evidence that this was for Chinese Muslims, or whether it was for Muslim traders in China?
Excellent question. So at the very earliest populations within China would have been Muslim merchants coming from the Arab world. There are varying records during that first Tang Dynasty of these Arab merchants who would be coming largely from the Arabian Peninsula, modern day Oman, the Gulf states in general in particular, where they would use the monsoon trading routes to get to southeastern China, stay there for a season, possibly up to a year, and then they would come back. However, over time, because as I said, this is already a pre-established trade route, it gains more importance when it has kind of the backing of an established state behind it instead of independent merchants to kind of help facilitate that trade a bit more. So the very earliest groups would have been essentially foreign merchants who reside in Guangzhou and go back. But over time, this population intermarries and we start having what really are Chinese Muslims. I'll get to kind of the moment that leads to the nucleus of that population. That's about 100 years later in the 8th century. But I'll get there in just 1 second. So as I already mentioned, there are really two primary connections between what we think of as the Islamic world or the heartland, what we think of maybe as the Middle East and China. One being more famous than the other, the Silk Road being the overland trade route that, coming again from a bit further north, from Zhuhao, going across Central Asia, making its way through Persia, and then eventually into Europe. But this trade route is largely controlled by Turks and Persians in its earliest days, and eventually these Turkic and Persian populations will become Muslim, but in the earlier days of the Silk Road, these are not all Muslims who are facilitating this trade. And also this overland route, think of logistics. Is it easier to transport something on a camel or a horse in a wagon, or is it easier to put it in a ship? So this overland trade route is used, in part it does have some trade aspects to it, but it's also, the more important dimension of it is actually more diplomatic trade, political envoys, and that type of exchange. Simply because of the logistics. It's much easier, cheaper, and for the merchants more profitable to move things via ship than over land. So this maritime route, which ends in Canton, or modern-day Guangzhou, uses the monsoon winds to be able to get from the Arabian Peninsula to southeastern China. And the reason the monsoon winds are so important to this trade is because when I say the monsoon winds, there are two monsoon winds. There is a summer monsoon and a winter monsoon. And the reason they're so important for Indian Ocean trade is they blow in opposite directions. So as a result, monsoon trading is a very predictable form of trade. You know, if you leave at a certain time with a certain monsoon wind, you have a very predictable timeline to when you would make it to your destination. And also, it's a very different type of trade than we think of, if you're thinking kind of a Western perspective of trade across the Mediterranean or across the Atlantic Ocean. This is a much more unpredictable trade, because there's no prevailing wind. You're tacking and you're hoping to find a wind that will eventually get you across. Whereas across the Indian Ocean, if you leave in the summer, that wind is blowing in one direction. You know, if you catch the summer monsoon and you leave between August and October, you will make it from Muscat, for example, to Barucha in a month, or 6 weeks. And then it would take, by jumping along the coast, using the monsoon winds, bit by bit, you could eventually make your way to China. The round trip going from Arabia to southeastern China and back would be about a 2-year trip. But the other thing to think about, we think of trade as a bilateral exchange. You know, I have one thing I'm giving you, and in return, I'm going to get one thing back. Pre-modern trading, and especially monsoon trading, was actually a series of trades, a series of relationships the entire way. Because the ships that they would be using weren't in the open water for very long. These aren't ships that are at sea for 6 months across the Atlantic. Instead, they would be in open water for a couple of weeks at most, making port along the way and continually trading the entire way. So as a result, by the time they would make it all the way to Canton, to Guangzhou, these Arab merchants, by and large, might not just have goods from Arabia, they might also have goods where they've gone to East Africa beforehand, or they've stopped in India, and they're bringing those to China to trade and then eventually bring those back to Arabia. This is, they're trading for Chinese silk, porcelain, jade, tea, and in exchange they're trading precious stones, ivory, spices, glass, pearls, rhinoceros horn, any other trade good along the way. And this is really where the overwhelming majority of trade goods make their way back and forth along this maritime Silk Road. And I'll mention in a little bit, this maritime route goes through ebbs and flows, predicated on the political situation both in the Islamic world within the Caliphate and within China. So before, when we had guessed, you had asked kind of where is that foundational moment of actually having Chinese Muslims? And oddly enough, a battle between the Abbasid Caliphate, or the Muslim world, and the Chinese of the Tang Dynasty, in an odd way, actually leads to a Muslim population in China. So this battle, which takes place in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, near Samarkand, is a 5-day battle between the Abbasids, who had only come to power the year before in 750, and the Tang Dynasty. And the Abbasids, this Muslim power, which is a combination of Turkic, Persian, and Arab troops, wins the day. But it's, in some ways, a not quite Pyrrhic victory, but it's a victory that doesn't actually gain the Abbasids much, because they never go further east. The Abbasids never push into China proper. Instead, Kyrgyzstan, I wish I had a map now, that ends up being the furthest extent to the east of the Islamic Empire, of the Abbasid Caliphate. What it does do, though, because the Abbasids now have control over large swaths of Central Asia, is it leads to the Islamification of these Central Asian populations. So you had this slow change. You have to remember, I'm not saying that overnight suddenly the population of Kyrgyzstan becomes Muslim, but over centuries of control, slowly these populations that might have been Buddhist, Confucian, some form of shamanism, slowly are becoming more and more Muslim. As well, oddly enough, the clerk from the losing side, from the Chinese army, an officer named Tu Huan, wrote actually the first written document talking about the beliefs and precepts of Islam within China, which is from this same year, from 751. And this is the earliest book in Chinese on Islam.
Good morning. Question for
Yes.
you. In what ways, a made-up word here, do the Chinese-fy Islam? If you know.
Yes. So I'm going to say it's a great question, and I will address it in about 20 minutes.
Okay.
The short version is it's a process. So the outward regard of someone, of how they dress, how they look, the Chinese Muslims, which will become known as, the word in English would be Hui, roughly pronounced Hui, are, after centuries, they will become indistinguishable from their Confucian or Buddhist Chinese brethren. Outwardly, they will look the same. And actually, part of the reason why Islam is fairly easily adapted with or accepted within China is because it doesn't violate, or it is in keeping with a number of Confucian ideals, and that you have some commonality between them. Yes?
So the development of Uyghurs is later?
So the Uyghurs are a different category. So there are two categories of, broadly speaking, Chinese Muslims, the Hui, which are, for lack of a better term, ethnic Chinese who are Muslim, and then the Uyghurs who are Turkic, from a different portion of China that become conquered later and have a much different relationship with the rest of China.
How do you spell that?
Uighur. That will be my second to last slide, so you'll have time. Yes?
What was the reason of starting to fight with each other?
So why they expanded?
Yeah, but you said they started war and they didn't expand.
So the reason-
What caused this? If there
So
were no
essentially
reasons?
it was especially during the period, what are known roughly speaking as the Islamic conquests. From the birth of Islam, you have the gradual expansion of the Caliphate or the Islamic Empire, whichever term you want to use, starting in Arabia, first controlling all of Arabia, and then pushing outward. Depending upon which scholar you ask, it depends upon just how violent or how peaceful this expansion was. But there's definitely battles, especially in the earlier days of Islam, with the Byzantines and the Sassanids. So the Byzantine Christians and the Zoroastrian Sassanids, where the young Muslim people are expanding outward, spreading the word of Islam, and conquering territory. Conquering territory because if you conquer a city, you get more tax base, you have more power, to help fuel the state. And the very early periods of the Islamic Empire, in a lot of ways, are actually fueled by that conquest. So the armies are paid by what they conquer. It is a much longer conversation to go into, are those conquests more peaceful or more violent? I'd be happy to talk to you during one of the breaks if you want more information about that. But the short version is when the Abbasids come to power in 750, they defeat the previous dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty, in 750, and they expand a tiny bit from what the footprint of the Islamic Empire had been under the Umayyads. And really, 751, there's one or two further battles where they push a little bit in this direction and that, but really that is the furthest extent of the empire. And why exactly they stopped expanding, or why they, I can't answer. I can just tell you that is when it stopped. Any other questions before I move on? So the other half of that equation, I talked about the Battle of Talas being, it helps the Islamification of Central Asia. The other reason, and this is truly the nucleus of the Hui, of Chinese Muslims proper, is the reapproachment that follows after. So the Tang Emperor actually requests Abbasid aid only 5 years after fighting the Abbasids, because they're the An-Lushan rebellion, where 2 different cities break away from the Tang Dynasty. A individual calls himself the Yan Emperor, and as a challenge to the Tang, and there's a request sent to the Abbasids, and the Abbasids in turn respond. They actually send 4,000 troops, which are largely Turkic troops, or Turkoman groups, from the region that's known in the Islamic Empire as Khorasan, that same kind of Kyrgyzstan area. And they do go fight on behalf of the Tang Dynasty. And they defeat this rebellion in the year 757. And as a reward to these troops, to these 4,000 troops, the Tang Emperor gives them the right to settle in Chang'an and Luoyang in China. And this is different from previous relations between the Muslims and the Chinese, because before they had been left in kind of foreign residence quarters, known as fanfeng, which would be foreign merchants which aren't only Muslims, they could be from Europe, they could be from Africa, where you would live in this one region kind of separated from the rest of the city as a foreign merchant, have different rules applying to you to some degree, with the understanding that you were not a full resident. You did not have the same rights as other Chinese. With this settlement of these 4,000 soldiers, or probably a little less, because I'm assuming some of them died, but of this soldier population, that's really the first group that is, for lack of a better word, naturalized into Chinese society, that are given a permanent place in China. And it's this group that will begin to intermarry, that will spread Muslim teachings throughout portions of China, and gradually this Chinese Muslim population will continue to grow. So by the time we actually reach the 9th century, there's reports of there being over 150,000 Muslims within China. So, but this population, by and large, are left to their own devices. And this is actually a fairly common imperial approach. You can look at this, that the Byzantines do this to some degree, later the Ottomans and Mughals and other groups will do this, where basically if there's a foreign group, they will be left to control themselves with a government appointed official. In this case, it would have been a qadi or a sheikh, qadi meaning judge, where it was their job to be the go-between between at this point, the Tang Dynasty, or the Chinese government, and that Muslim population. And it'd be their job also to collect taxes. And basically, as long as you paid your taxes, you were quiet, you were left to your own devices. And as a sign of this growing relationship between at this point, the first Umayyad and then Abbasid dynasties within the Islamic world, and the Tang Chinese, there are over 37 different emissaries sent back and forth between these two powers. So it's a political relationship, it's a trade relationship, it's a diplomatic relationship. And because you have these frequent exchanges between the two, we're led to understand that it's a fairly stable relationship as well. Unfortunately, the Tang period of trade will end in 897 with the Guangzhou rebellion, which was really a rebellion aimed against foreign merchants, where local Chinese merchants largely led the rebellion, that they're angry at the preferential treatment that these foreign merchants are receiving, and it's not only targeted at Muslim traders, but thousands of Muslim traders do die in this rebellion. As a result, after this rebellion, this really ends the period of trade between the Tang Dynasty and the Muslim world. And it'll take almost a century for those relations to be restarted, and a change of dynasty as well. So the Tang Dynasty will fall, and it will be the first Sung emperor who comes to power in 968, Taizu, who will actually send a goodwill mission to the Abbasid Caliph Al-Muti to try and reopen that trade dialogue, to reopen that diplomatic and political connection between these two powers. The Abbasid Caliph Al-Muti reciprocates, and he in turn also sends a goodwill mission carrying gifts for the Chinese emperor a few years later, and this is the resumption of Arab-Sino trade relations. And it's during the Song period that Canton, or modern-day Guangzhou, will become the busiest trade center in the world. Some of that is because of this trade that's coming along the Maritime Silk Road, that it becomes such an integral port and point of exchange between these two great powers. Then things will begin to change. And I'm sure you all are in varying degrees familiar with the Mongols. And the Mongols have, in some ways, a bit of a split personality when we think of their impact. They are, without a doubt, an exceptionally violent conquest of China proper, Central Asia, and in portions then into the Islamic Empire, into the Muslim world. And these conquests first started under Chinggis Khan, and then his successors, in particular his grandson as well, or grandsons, will conquer portions of China and will actually eventually topple the Abbasid Caliphate, or the last little bits of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258 with the sacking of Baghdad, which is what this painting represents. Starting in 1270, we will actually have the creation of a Mongol Chinese empire. So with the death, with Chinggis Khan's grandsons, most importantly Hulagu, who is the one who leads the sack of Baghdad and fight against the Islamic Empire, and Kublai Khan, who is the one who actually topples the Song dynasty, the one who defeats the Chinese Empire at that time, and in turn leads to the creation of a Mongol-led Chinese empire. And what happens is the division of the territory that had been conquered by the Mongols into 4 different khanates. The Great Khan, which will eventually become the Yuan dynasty, or the Mongol-led Chinese dynasty. The Golden Horde, which is the Khanate that is in modern-day Russia and Crimea. The Ilkhanate, which was the Mongol-led territory over much of Central Asia going towards the Muslim world, and then the Chagatai Khanate, which is actually up into the Caucasus. With the division of these 4 khanates, oddly enough, after all of that destruction, all of that fighting, what we actually have in turn afterwards is a period of prosperity and open trade. And the way this affects the Muslim population is also slightly counterintuitive. Even though the Muslims early in the period of the Mongol conquest are targeted, thousands of Muslims are killed in Baghdad and the areas surrounding it, they actually in turn become some of the leading administrators of these khanates. The Mongols, which are a nomadic people that haven't really dealt with civil administration, they haven't had to collect taxes, they haven't had to make sure roads are repaired or collect trade tariff, rely on this Muslim population to do a lot of that work for them. In particular, Abdul Rahman, even before under the period of Chinggis Khan, or Genghis Khan, becomes the leader of imperial finance in 1224. Mahmud Yalavash is appointed a governor over northwestern China. So here was the map I was hoping for a slide before. So this, what we know would be the Great Khan or Yuan dynasty, which is unified in 1270. Then we have the Chagatai Khanate, which is kind of Central Asia, the Ilkhanate, which is portions of Persia going into modern-day Iraq, and then the Golden Horde in the north, with going all the way up to the Caucasus. All of these khanates they're all Mongol khanates, but that doesn't mean they like one another. But it does mean, because they are all Mongol, what it leads to is what's referred to frequently as Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace. And what this period does is it leads to very open exchange of ideas, of learning, of trade across this now suddenly unified territory. Where instead of going from state to state to state, where before you would have to secure your entrance into a new state, have to pay new tariffs or new entries, now because it's one singular Mongol empire, even when it's divided into the different khanates, you have a much more open flow of communication. This includes a transfusion of the Islamic sciences, of the teachings of Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, or Averroes, Avicenna, teachings from the Greek world that had been maintained and in some cases improved upon by Muslim scholars that are now making their way into Central Asia, into this larger Chinese world. And then this also includes the Chinese zodiac that is used today is, at this point, based upon actually Muslim astronomy and usage of Muslim astronomical science to better divide those different years and periods that are integral to any lunar-based calendar. What also happens during Pax Mongolica is over time, these various khanates, with the exception of the Yuan, all of them eventually have their leadership convert to Islam. The first to convert is the Golden Horde, led by Baraka Khan in 1256. And then later, the leaders of the Ilkhanate and the Chagatai Khanate will also in turn convert to Islam. Even though the leadership converts to Islam, that doesn't in turn mean the population underneath of them converts. In some cases, it actually leads to a great deal of animosity, where there are now splinter groups who break away saying they don't want to be part of this Muslim-led empire, that it's turning their back on Confucian or Buddhist or other ideals. But it does, simply by having your leadership being a certain religion. You can see similar themes when the Roman Empire converts to Christianity. It becomes increasingly advantageous to be Muslim because it will help your relations, help your standing within that political entity. After the fall of the Mongols, so after the collapse of these various khanates at different times, we have the rise of the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty is the second to last of the dynasties of the Chinese Empire. And throughout the Ming, we still continue to have the way population continue to intermarry, continue to become more and more integrated within broader Chinese society and culture. And an example of this is the Admiral Zheng He. Zheng He is the leading naval figure of the Chinese imperial period. And I'll show you a little video about him in just a moment, but he is Hui. He is a Chinese Muslim who becomes a eunuch, I imagine against his wishes, early in his life, becomes the highest naval official within the Chinese Empire under the Ming. He leads a massive fleet of over 300 ships for diplomatic trade missions across much of the Indian Ocean and into the Mediterranean, Middle East. I say trade missions. These were missions not meant so much to facilitate trade, but more to convince people of the power of the Ming Dynasty. These treasure ships would come and give gifts to other leaders, and the idea was to awe them, to show we have such power, such authority, look how gigantic this ship is, we would recommend you don't try and mess with us. You could also send us tribute, that would be fine too. And it's really a period of transition, because we move from these voyages of Zheng He, this kind of open, the Ming Dynasty kind of demonstrating how much power they have, to a couple of decades later to the Ming actually shifting to a period of isolationism, which will last hundreds of years thereafter, where China goes from being very open to other trade, foreign merchants, to suddenly being closed. But before we move that, start my video.
1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 voyages throughout the Indian Ocean, the expeditions of these so-called treasure ships.
Could we dim the light, maybe?
Columbus's first voyage consisted of 3 ships. Zheng He led an armada of over 300 with a crew of over 27,000, more than half of London's population at the time. And some of these ships were, well, enormous. The flagships, known as the treasure ships, were over 400 feet long and had 7 or more masts. You see that tiny little ship there in front of the treasure ship? That's a to-scale rendering of Christopher Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria. Zheng He wasn't an explorer. The Indian Ocean trade routes were already known to him and to other Chinese sailors. He visited Africa, India, and the Middle East, and in a way, his journeys were trade missions, but not in the sense of filling his ships up with stuff to be sold later for higher prices. At the time, China was the leading manufacturer of quality goods in the world, and there wasn't anything they actually needed to import. What they needed was prestige and respect, so that people would continue to see China as the center of the economic universe. So there was a tribute system through which foreign rulers or their ambassadors would come to China and engage in a debasing ritual called the kowtow, wherein they acknowledged the superiority of the Chinese emperor and offered him, or her, but usually him, gifts in exchange for the right to trade with China. The opportunity to humble yourself before the Chinese emperor was so valuable that many a prince was happy to jump on a treasure ship and sail back to China with Zheng He. Also, these tribute missions brought lots of crazy things to China, including exotic animals. From Africa, Zheng He brought back a zoo's worth of rhinos, zebras, and even giraffes. Basically, he was like the medieval Chinese noble.
For those of you not familiar with it, that's from the Crash Course History website. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. So after Zheng He, after the kind of closing of the Ming, where they become increasingly isolationist, we also in turn have a change of how the Muslim population within China is regarded, understood, and treated. We have this isolationist tendency that first starts under the Ming and then is continued under the Qing dynasty, which is the last dynasty of China, rules from 644 to 1912. And what happens during this period of isolation, for the first 2 centuries of the Qing, the Hui are more or less cut off from the rest of the Muslim world. Because the Chinese are isolationists, they don't want open trade, open communication with other powers, this population doesn't have the opportunity to connect with the broader Muslim world, whether that was in Southeastern Asia or Middle East, North African region. This begins to change when we hit the period of kind of the great powers in the 19th century. And why this changes has everything to do with how the Ottoman Empire tries to appeal and invoke the idea of the Islamic State, or the Hui Gao. And the reason for this is the Ottomans in the middle of the 19th century are not in the best shape. They are going through a period of different reforms. Tanzimat, they try to modernize their military. They do a number of different things to try and keep away the other great powers, in particular Russia. Russia was always the biggest boogeyman for the Ottoman Empire. And under the rule of Abdul Hamid II, who rules from 1876 to 1908, this sultan really becomes a proponent of this idea of pan-Islamism. And pan-Islamism is essentially the idea of you should support your fellow Muslims, and in particular fellow Muslim states. And I use the term states closely because really what Abdul Hamid II means is you should support me. You should support the Ottomans as the leading Muslim state in the world against these other powers. And he tries to appeal to Muslim populations throughout the world to in turn support the Ottomans. And this shows up financially as well. The Hijaz Railway, which is the railroad that starts in Istanbul and eventually makes it all the way down to Medina and never actually makes it all the way to Mecca, is largely funded by Muslims living outside of the Ottoman Empire as opposed to those living inside the Ottoman Empire. And the hope is that the way these Chinese Muslims will be one of these groups that will support the Ottomans and possibly convince the Qing dynasty to also support the Ottoman Empire. So that the idea is that these populations might help support the Ottoman Empire politically, economically, diplomatically. However, this all changes when we hit World War I. The Qing dynasty falls in 1912, about right before we hit World War I. And as a result, this idea of the Islamic State, of the Huai Gao, changes. It actually changes from meaning a singular Islamic state to the support of Muslim states. So this broadening of this definition in turn means that the Hui become connected to, instead of a single leading state, to a variety of Muslim states that are developing both in the Levant, the Middle East proper, and North Africa. Also, the Hui, after kind of the fall of pan-Islamism, with the fall of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, is forced out in 1909, that there's an appeal to Easternism. Easternism being the broad idea of the spiritual superiority of the East opposed to the West. And the Hui, as being part of the East, this is another way for them to connect with other Muslim populations. Leading Muslim scholars from Egypt, from Syria, notably Rashid Rida from Egypt, write treatises in support of Easternism, in support of this idea that we are all connected as part of the Eastern world and should work together against, or as a bulwark against the attempted expansion of the Western world. The Hui are also used as a way to combat within China. This is during both the Qing and also during the period of the Republic of China, as a counterbalance to Japanese aggression. That the Hui are looked at, you are Chinese Muslims, but you are also Chinese, and you should support us against these foreign aggressors. And you are part of us, you are not part of them. So you have essentially this becoming more friendly, or openly friendly, with the Hui at this turn of the 19th to the 20th century, because they can be advantageous to whether it's the Qing or the Republic of China. This all drastically changes when we move to the communist period in 1949. The Hui moved from being a religious group to becoming an ethnic group. So we move from a period of various different sects within China to there being, according to the Maoist state, there being 56 minority ethnic nationalities. And the Hui moved from being Hui Zhaitao, which are followers of Islam, to Hui Min, meaning the Hui people. So they moved from being a religious classification to being an ethnic classification. And similar to treatment of all religions under communist ideals, open practice of religion becomes somewhat curtailed. And it depends upon the exact period and the exact region of just how curtailed that practice is. However, the Hui are never actively targeted in the same way that the Uyghurs are. Uyghurs are viewed as not being Chinese. They are Turkic. They are another group. And as a result of that, because they're viewed as being different, the Chinese state's treatment of them, particularly from the middle of the 20th century forward, is noticeably different than it is of those of the Hui. So they are, as I said, the Uyghurs are Turkic. They're more ethnically similar and in practice to Central Asian peoples than they are to the Chinese. They're only conquered by the Chinese state under the Qing in the middle of the 18th century. They are briefly independent and then reincorporated under Communist China in 1949 and are designated as an autonomous region similar to the treatment of Tibet. You are part of China, but slightly different. And because they're part of an autonomous region, because they are viewed as different, their right to practice, there are different laws that apply to the Uyghurs than apply to the Hui Chinese. Yes?
So this is like all super cool, right?
Yes.
Because, I know for me, the thrust is in this narrative, the Westerners coming to imperialize and Christianize, and you don't really get this Muslim piece. So what I'm interested in is, you just said, let's look at ourselves as Chinese, that became the new thrust. So what are Chinese Muslims, if anything, doing when the Opium War is happening, the Boxer Rebellion is happening? Are they recognizing this thing that you're telling me about? Or when we talk about those two things in our classes, is it still distinctly a traditional Chinese person who might be Buddhist rather than?
So I'll give you a short version, and then I will also kick the question to, I believe our speaker from the afternoon is more of a specific Chinese scholar than I am, so I will slightly defer. But it really depends upon where people are and the way they're treated at any given time. So the Hui become more incorporated into the Chinese society. They intermarry, they are accepted, they look the same. They might pray differently, but they assimilate to a large degree. And as a result of that assimilation, I imagine, I can't speak with complete confidence, that their feelings towards the Boxer Rebellion or kind of foreign Western incursion would be similar to that of their Buddhist compatriots, because it's not like Muslims would suddenly be better treated after the Europeans forced themselves into China. The Muslims are still seen as an other, as part of an Orient that would be different from Christendom of Western Europe. And I'm painting in broad strokes, so take it with a grain of salt. But it would, I imagine, I can't really see the reason why they would see it as advantageous to have Western incursion at that point in time. And as I said, if one of the other speakers who knows more about that, and feel free to correct me, but you have to think of, if they've been incorporated into Chinese society for centuries at this point, why would the sudden incursion of a foreign power be appealing to them? And they're not appealing to them as Muslims. They're just saying, we're forcing our way into forced trade. To break the isolationist tendencies of the Qing Dynasty. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
So, to wrap up with the Uyghurs, right now there are roughly 11 million Uyghurs within broader China, the overwhelming majority of them within this autonomous region. And as I said, they are treated differently by the Chinese government. There are beard laws and hijab laws, and basically the degree to which they can outwardly present themselves as different or as Muslim is seen fundamentally different than ethnic Chinese Muslims or the Hui. And in particular, the Chinese government paints them as being violent militants, that they are terrorist groups, that they're a splinter group, that in some way is threatening the broader Chinese state. How that dialogue advances, there is someone who will be talking about this, I know, in the coming days in more detail of kind of the modern Chinese state and the treatment of these different groups. But the last thing I wanted to end on is kind of a transition, this will be discussed later on, is the new policy of the One Belt, One Road and Maritime Silk Road. So what had been kind of established trade connections in the pre-modern world, the modern Chinese state under President Xi Jinping, starting in 2013, is making this appeal to basically rebuild these connections as a way through which the Chinese can be better equipped to facilitate trade across Central Asia by building new roads, new train networks, infrastructural development, and new ports throughout Central Asia, and then as well throughout Southeastern Asia, to help facilitate greater trade across China, Central Asia, Russia, and Europe. As some of this is motivated by China's increasing reliance on Middle Eastern, in particular Gulf oil. China is the leading importer of oil from the Gulf in the world. And it depends by country just how much the Chinese import from any one of those countries. I know, for example, Oman's leading trade partner because of their oil trade is with China. And you'll see Chinese corporations doing port development throughout the Middle East, Southeast China, as a way to try and spur this economic vision. I will end here of just something to think upon. I know there will be a speaker, I believe, later today actually talking exactly about this. The reason I wanted to end with this is to try and bring us a little bit full circle of starting from a period of trade and connection in a pre-modern concept of this early connections with the Muslim world and China to now a modern connection which has an inherently different goal in mind. It is not only trade, but it's now a different discussion of whether or not we were talking about hard power, which we might have before with portions of the Maritime Silk Road and the Silk Road, to one of perhaps soft economic power and influence with the One Belt, One Road and Maritime Silk Road policies. So, thank you for your attention. Any questions? Yes?
On both of your maps, the initial map and then this map, there doesn't seem to be a real connection on this East China Sea between China and Vietnam, or what we would call Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
What's the connection there, both at the beginning and now, in terms of interaction? And then the second part of that is, what about the Japanese connection to all of this?
So I admit I can't fully answer that. I can tell you the spread of Islam goes through Southeastern Asia. Indonesia has the largest Muslim population in the world. It is a gradual process. It's through the trade of the Spice Islands, which are trade that Muslim traders from Arabia are doing over a millennia ago. And when you trade with people for extended periods of time, you're not just trading goods, you're trading ideas and exchange of beliefs. The treatment of the Korean, or the way in which Muslims are treated in Japan and in particular Korea during various periods of Chinese control over portions of those peninsulae, it depends on what period you're looking at. The Hui are treated a bit more, again in broad strokes, a bit more openly in mainland China than they are in Korea, but I really can't answer in more detail than that. We're already brushed right up against the extent of my knowledge, so I don't want to venture further than that.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
I would like to ask, where in your presentation, if you want to go back a few slides, does the Belitung shipwreck and its cargo fit?
Okay,
I
sure.
think back to the Song, is that correct?
Yes. No, it would be Song. Oh, no, it would be, it's from, I don't know exactly what year. No, it is Tang, you're right. So, I'm trying to think. it's roughly down here-ish, so I don't have a map exact. So the wreck that,
I think maybe your earlier map that showed the different cities.
yes,
Yeah,
you're
right
right.
there.
So the Belitung shipwreck is a shipwreck that's found off the coast of modern-day Indonesia near Singapore. That's a wreck from an Arab merchant ship, likely from Oman in the middle of the 9th century. And this is one of the most intact shipwrecks that's ever been found in Southeastern Asia for trade during this period. And it gave a lot of different information about what was being traded, the size of ships that were being done, and the ship in particular of that wreck was notable. The way they knew it was an Arab Gulf ship was because the ship itself was not nailed together, it was sewn together. So ships in particular that came from Oman and some of the other Arab Gulf states, or Gulf regions of that period, as a way to adapt to monsoon trading, would not be nailed together, instead they would be sewn together. The reason being, with the monsoon winds, it has a positive and a negative. Because there is a very clear prevailing wind, you have an explicit window in which to leave. If you miss your window, you are stuck for a year. That wind's not coming back. And for merchants who may have had perishable goods, or just simple matter of you can't make money unless you keep moving along, it became more important to have a ship that was more easily repaired than to have one that was the most sturdy ship possible. So to think of it this way, if you have a nailed together box, and that box hits the floor, it's not just a break at the point that hits the ground, it's a catastrophic failure because it splinters and breaks all the way along. Same thing would be true of a nailed together ship along the hull. It wouldn't just be the one point where you ran aground and had coral pierce part of the ship. It would be an entire side of the ship would basically be destroyed and would then have to be dry docked and repaired. But if you have a sewn together ship, which has more give, where you had that impact, you would maybe have a plank or two that are damaged. And it would be very fast to fix them because all you would do is put the ship ashore or just above the waterline, literally unsew that section of the ship, which was sewn together with coconut hemp rope known as quar, throw in a new plank, sew it back up together, and you're on your way. And this type of, and that Belitung wreck showed that it was very clearly a sewn together ship. This in turn led to a co-organized effort by the Sultanate of Oman and Singapore to create what was called the Jewel of Muscat, which was a naval ship reconstruction that was launched from Oman in, I can't remember what year it was launched. I want to say like 5-7 years ago-ish, that sailed from Muscat all the way to Singapore. And it recreated the same route that Belitung wreck would have likely have made. And is now part of the Singapore Maritime Museum. And these types of connections, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, are indicative of this connection between the Muslim world and Chinese or Southeast Asian world, but they're also hearkening to a period of trade that's even older than all of that as well. Yes?
I was going to ask, are there many Chinese Muslims in the government today in China? Do they have political power? And what is the intermarriage rate between or among Chinese people and Muslims?
I cannot answer that. I will defer to one of our other speakers who will talk more about modern China. I know before the communist state, even during the Republican period, there were Muslims in government positions, but I can't speak to what the current status is, unfortunately. Yes?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is a minor question.
Sure.
The Luoyang and Chang'an dispensations, were they contemporaneous, and how did they persist going forward?
Say that one more time and slower.
So those dispensations in Luoyang and Chang'an, were they at the same time?
Yes, so those were immediately as a reward for participation in the put down of the Anlushan rebellion, that the Tang emperor basically said, as a reward for your valor, we will give you land in these two regions. So it was the difference of before where they were only part of foreign merchant communities, where this is the first time that Muslims are given territory within China proper.
And how did those persist? I know in Xi'an there's a continuing.
I mean, there's continuing Muslim populations in both of those regions. Exactly if it's this, I imagine the dispensation portion of it is no longer particularly relevant. It's more of just, it's almost a millennia and a half of Muslim presence in those regions. But more than that, I couldn't say. Yes?
Given the dangers of the monsoon maritime routes, must have been highly profitable
Yes.
to take that risk, right?
Yeah, so that's an excellent point. So the maritime route, it is slightly dangerous, but it's not as dangerous as you might think it is. So because there's a regular prevailing winds, like there always can be a sudden storm or something can go awry. Maritime trading always has a degree of risk, but it actually was much safer and had far better returns than the Silk Road route, because one, it was much faster and it was much more regular. Think of it as any type of logistics. When any type of shipping becomes more regular and more predictable, the rates of it go down and the goods also go down in price, which in turn facilitates further trading. So the Maritime Silk Road, you had some risk, absolutely, but one successful mission coming back would make the captain a rich man. If you came back with a ship laden with silk and porcelain and everything else after 2 years, that was a significant financial windfall. And there were wrecks, there is some risk in it, but it's also the reason why, generally speaking, the captains of ships are not the owners of the ships. It is an investment like any others, and you have to assume for however many ships you send out, you might expect a certain number of them not to come back. But it was profitable enough that even if you lost, 1 out of every 4 ships, it was still worth the effort.
Because we think of monsoons today, we see that the winds and the rains, how could you possibly take a ship out of that?
So it also depends, that's also the reason that they had a very specific season when they went, and a route that they took. So those big typhoons and things going across India, most of the trading would have been before the rains really hit. So usually the winds, depends on the region, the prevailing wind would predate or would come before the weather associated with it. So as a result, they have a window in which if you leave at this point, you're likely to have both the wind and not a terrible crossing. But they're also saved by the fact they're not, if you're looking at this map, these traders would never be in the middle of the Arabian Sea or the middle of the Bay of Bengal. They're hugging the coast the entire way. So if there's a particularly bad storm, it's likely that they can put into port somewhere, wait it out a little bit and then go back out. Though the ships that they're using, in particular, from the Arabian side, I can't speak to the Chinese side, were slightly dangerous in the fact that the hold was only for goods. All of the men in the ship, from the captain on down, all lived on the deck of the ship. So there was no escaping the elements. If you were going through a squall, everyone was going through that squall. So there was clearly risks attached to it. Yes?
How did the Sunni-Shia tensions play out in the Islamic settlements in China?
So the complicated question, so I'm trying to give you a digestible answer. So for portions of Central Asia, in particular when you're thinking of Sunni-Shia divisions, the likelihood of there being a Sunni population there or a Shiite population has everything to do with what the prevailing power at a certain period of time was. So by and large, like modern Sunni-Shiite divisions between, if you were thinking kind of Iraq and modern day Iran, have everything to do with the fact that the Ottoman Empire and the Safavids went back and forth over the control of that territory. And the Safavids during the 16th century had a certain degree of compulsion of religion, where people had to be Shiites, even if they had been Sunni or some other religion previously. And as a result, under the Safavids, they are becomes increasingly advantageous to be Shiite, whereas the Ottomans are a Sunni power. It depends exactly what power was at any given time, kind of what the motivation was. The Hui, by and large, are Sunni. They are, in particular, they are, I believe, Hanafi Muslims, by and large. Someone correct me if I'm mistaken.
I can't correct any of that, but I do know that, and by the way, I put in some articles, I've uploaded into day one, some articles from the Oxford History. It has some good articles on Central Asia and China and Islam there, and also in Africa. There's 3 articles. But there's a strong Sufi component of different groups, so I think that would sort of mitigate that issue, because being Sufi is neither Sunni nor Shia. And there are various different groups. There's a lot of interesting stuff in that Oxford article on that topic.
And I don't really believe
From
that there's a
Middle Ages to modern times.
history of Sunni Shiite clashes, as it were, in China or Central Asia, partially because, as Susan just mentioned, it's largely a Sufi population, and also because they almost entirely are Sunni. There's not really a large Shiite population that would lead to misunderstanding. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for your attention. And if anyone's interested, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint if anyone would like it for future use.
Please do leave it right on the desktop.